Good evening, everyone. I'm Brenda Cole, I'm Vice President, and I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Raffi Andonian. And he is the #1 best-selling author of Creating Space for Conflicted Histories and a frequent speaker on the topic of public cultural sites. He's worked as an historical guide at the Gettysburg battlefield, at Civil War sites all around Richmond, Virginia, and at the birthplace of the atomic bomb in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Also at the childhood home of Martin Luther King Jr. Raffi holds a master's degree in history and another master's degree in historic preservation. He's a member of the board of directors of the National Atomic Museum Foundation, which is a Smithsonian affiliate. And Raffi, I'm going to turn everything over to you.
Alrighty, thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it. And you know, I wanted to start out for a moment so you see my face before I jump into the photos and the screen. So right now you should be seeing me, right? You don't see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I want to talk about is kind of my journey through some different controversial historic sites and help provide some images and kind of my process for writing this over the course of sort of the next time together that we have. I encourage a lot of questions. This is something that really, one of my big things on this is dialogue and different perspectives and understanding. So please feel free to jump in with questions in the chat and try to leave a good amount of time at the end to help address some of those. So I'm going to put up the images now so we can jump into that. So what I want to think about is, as I mentioned, you know, to me, this stuff is about, whoops, sorry about that. Having a little bit of trouble for a moment. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So what I want to talk about is sort of where this began for me, the power of place. When I was a little kid, there was a pen that I had, a pen that was a Betsy Ross flag. And the Betsy Ross flag pen was something that was so treasured to me as a 3rd, 4th grader. And one time I walked off the school bus, and when I walked off the school bus, I discovered that my pen had fallen out of my pocket, and I freaked out. And I was walking home to, you know, my house, obviously where I was growing up. And, you know, I kind of picked up the pace a little bit and jumped in and, you know, talked to my parents or my mom and said, you know, I lost this pen. I don't know what to do. And she called up the school bus headquarters or whatever the dispatch was. And they actually went looking for my pen because it was so important for me. Now, why does this matter? Because I got that pen when I was in Philadelphia as a little kid. And when I had learned about sort of my first exposure to history was kind of the East Coast history, if you will, as a little one. I wanted to go out to the East Coast. And when I went to the East Coast, I got this pen that was representative of the place for me. And that's the kind of beginning of a thread that I started to walk through. And over time, as I went through middle school and high school and eventually college, I found myself in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, I was in a Civil War class at Penn State University, and I had this opportunity come across that the professor announced, which was about, you know, an internship at Gettysburg, the battlefield. And I was pretty excited about that. I was like, well, this is why I came to the East Coast. I went from California to the East Coast. I grew up in LA, and I wanted to kind of, you know, immerse myself in these different sites. And a year later, I got that internship, and for several years thereafter, every summer, as I went through undergrad and graduate school, I was going to the battlefield at Gettysburg, now as a seasonal park ranger doing interpretation. And I was actually not an intern anymore, I was working there. And when I was at Gettysburg, there were a lot of things that influenced me. One was the variety of perspectives that people brought to the table there from different states. Someone from Michigan to Alabama was going to have a different perspective. Sometimes it was generational. Sometimes it had to do with their life experience or maybe a different country that they came from, because not everyone there would come from the United States because Gettysburg is such a monumental event. And one of the things I learned there was on the site of such massive sacrifice, and to this day it remains the bloodiest battle in the Western Hemisphere that we know of, and certainly in American history. There's going to be a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different ways to handle communicating with different people to make sure that we can still have a dialogue and help people use a place as a way to learn and reflect. And finally, towards the later part of my time in grad school, I worked at the Martin Luther King home, which was in Atlanta, right downtown, also a national park site. And when I was there was a really powerful moment that reminded me of the power of place. It kind of brings my journey through these historic sites in my young years, if you will, to kind of the full circle to me, which is that one day I was walking and guiding a group of folks, about maybe 10 of them. And one was a chaperone and the others were kids between age 10 to 13, let's say, and that kind of just before teenage years. And they had clearly had scars, and had been, physically beaten. It was very obvious. Some of them, one of them, for example, had his skull had been kind of pushed in, had kind of this caving in. Another one had various scars on his face and neck. And you could tell that they had been through a lot. And I asked the chaperone kind of the story of how they're here and what's going on and what the story was. And we were walking outside of the home. We were on the property, not quite inside the walls yet. And what he told me was that the kids that were with me were actually escaped slaves. They were slaves that had escaped from Haiti, from the illegal human trafficking trade. Now, why were they at Martin Luther King home? This was probably around 2010, and Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. So here we were, 40 plus years later. These kids obviously were not alive in the late 60s, but they came here because of what they viewed as the memory or the legacy of Martin Luther King. When they went through what they did, despite King having been at least a generation prior, in a different country, somehow that spoke to them, and this is the place that they wanted to come to. Those stories to me speak to the power of a place to provoke people into an experience that nothing else can achieve. So I took that experience and kind of influenced kind of my how I view things and how I approach things. And I've just picked a few personal examples. So what you see on the left side is me presenting on the Confederate battle flag when I worked at Gettysburg. What you see on the right side is myself working on a fence on an archaeological site. And this will make sense as we walk through the story. So a few examples of contested histories. The Enola Gay exhibit in the Smithsonian in the mid-1990s. Many of you may remember this. This was, of course, a big controversy about whether or not we should have the exhibit. A lot of different perspectives were there, some heroic, some not. But what I want to focus on is dinner that I had just not long ago with Paul Tibbets IV, who is the grandson of Paul Tibbets II, who flew the Enola Gay to drop the first atomic bomb. One of the things that I found really fascinating in my personal story with him was that his grandfather, who had participated in that, obviously like I said, flew the plane for the first bomb, thought that the exhibit should be there, not necessarily for people to believe one particular story, but for people to have a place to draw their own conclusions, for people to come in and to have a place to reflect. And I find that fascinating because in the years later, in the 1990s, many of the people who were debating about this stuff may not have remembered the Second World War certainly as vividly as Paul Tibbets did. We're very strong on one side or another of an opinion that no, it has no place because we're glorifying, or yes, it should because we need to glorify. But the person that actually participated in this had a very different perspective about the power of place, about the power of reflecting, and one that was not necessarily all one side or another. It was gray. And that's, to me, is kind of what I call these contested histories. Similarly, in the Confederate battle flag, you know, you think about it, this is kind of comes up every few years. There's something that happens that really comes up. Obviously, recently with the protests. Before that, you might remember the Dylan Roof shootings. Before that, there was a lot more stuff on state capitals. There's still kind of this, still pops up here and there, but there was a lot more of it in the late 90s and early 2000s. All the way back, you know, to the 1960s, there's all kinds of controversies around the Confederate flag. What I find fascinating about the Confederate flag as a symbol in this case, not so much a site, is, you know, over the generations, over the years, there are different ways that the Confederate flag was used. Sometimes it was used in the 1890s by the veterans as sort of an artifact, like the actual flags that were on the battlefield. And years later, reproductions were used for different purposes to mean different meanings. In the 1960s, you did have, that's when the Klan really takes on using it. They didn't use it before then, but that's when they take on using it, and it starts to take on a different meaning, one that we kind of find maybe, you know, more objectionable today. What's fascinating to me is the battle flag, without getting too far into it right now, but for some context, it's all about where it's displayed and how it's displayed. That helps determine the intent. And you will get to this in a little bit when I come back to some questions that I'd like to ask. But I want us to think about different types of situations here. We started out with the historic sites. We came to the Enola Gay, which is a museum exhibit. We go to the Confederate battle flag, which is a symbol, and I'd even argue a form of art because of the way it's displayed. It's very often in different kinds of artwork. And finally, going to conservation archaeology. There was a brief bit where I interned at the Archaeological Conservancy. It was where I started out when I was first in New Mexico. And there I am, you know, working on a fence. We're in Cortez, Colorado there, at one of the Archaeological Conservancy sites. You can kind of see half a person, his elbow there. Apparently he's watching while I'm working. So they were not participating with me, but, but the idea here, my point here being that why was I building a fence and not digging the place up? Now, you guys know, I'm sure many of you do, that the idea behind conservation archaeology is how the Archaeological Conservancy was founded. And it's kind of been a thing for now for some time. That was a shift from the prior decades. In the early part of the 20th century, you have a lot of, you know, destroying a site by digging it up and potentially, you know, disrespecting a site. Today, there's a conservation approach that is designed to protect the site and looking and researching for increasingly less invasive ways of doing research at a site without destroying it, and of course, being more culturally sensitive. And so to me, again, what this represents is in a site of archaeology with artifacts, it's another layer because, you know, unlike in the Civil War battlefield, which is a form of an archaeological site, you don't have quite the same cultural boundaries to deal with. And this is a little bit different circumstance where you might come into graves and so on and so forth. And so now you have a site where you have these different perspectives and layers because you want to learn from it, but you want to be respectful. And of course, there are different perspectives and ways of interpreting the data that are at these archaeological sites. So what all of this sets the stage for, in my view, is, you know, understanding that these different formats of consumption of these, you know, if you will, materials of the past are going to influence how we see and how we view what it is that we're looking at. So this is kind of where I come to my guiding questions. So some background before we jump into the questions. So as you saw, my first book here, Creating Space for Conflicted History, Remembering the Atomic Bomb. Now, I took the lens of the atomic bomb in this situation as a case study for this book. And particularly, I was looking at the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. So Manhattan Project National Historical Park was an effort that started in the early 2000s, culminating between 2012 to 2014. In 2012, there was a bill that was introduced in Congress called the Manhattan Project National Historical Park Bill. And it was a bill that was designed to create the national park. That was a national park with 3 sites. There were probably 3 most key sites, if you will, for the Manhattan Project. Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. And 3 different sites, but 1 park, to have a place to, interpret the Manhattan Project. Of course, the Manhattan Project was what led to the creation of the atomic bomb. Caused a lot of controversy, though. And one of the reasons that it caused controversy in Congress, and it failed to pass, was that people were asking, well, are we glorifying the bomb? Are we kind of, does it mean that if we create these national parks, are we celebrating it? And it kind of got at a few different things here. What does a national park really mean? Are national parks forums for celebration? Is the national park itself a monument of sorts? Not necessarily a statue, but itself as existing as a national park. Is it making a monument? And what is its purpose? And there are too many questions around that, and so that's part of the reason that it failed. And it took a couple more years for it to finally pass, and of course it passed as part of a defense spending bill, so it didn't even pass as a standalone. And that's how the park came into creation. Now, it still doesn't fully exist because there was a study that was done for several years. Now there's kind of the beginnings of the national park, meaning there's a visitor center if you go to Los Alamos now that is designed for the national park. You do not still have full access to all the areas the national park would like to have access to, some of which are behind the fence, which means you'd have to, of course, do some clearance in advance. So it's still in progress and coming into fruition, but it does exist in a legal sense, and it is a beginnings of a national park. Why does that matter? Because that controversy, to me, gets at these questions that we should be asking. If you were to read the book, you would see that I laid out the 4 main chapters, 1 chapter each on one of these questions. And I simply tried to answer these questions in using the Manhattan Project National Park, remembering the atomic bomb, as a case study, but you could apply any of the stuff that I discussed before to this as well. You could write another book with these questions, just looking at those particular issues or particular incidents that I described before, or symbols. So let me get into the questions a little bit. And to me, this is important because I approach controversial sites, if you will, or whatever you want to call them, contested histories, conflicted histories. I approach them with questions rather than with one way of looking at something. I believe that when you look back in history and you look into the past, it's usually a lot richer and a lot more complicated than what you initially think. It doesn't fit into the neat box that you or I or any of us already believe should be there. It's a complicated tapestry, just as people are a complicated tapestry. And to me, then, I come in with questions rather than a black and white answer. But the first question is, why remember? When you're creating a site like the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, or whatever the case may be, a local community site, why remember? What is the significance of what it is that you're remembering? I worked at Gettysburg and I worked at Los Alamos, 2 certainly significant places, right? Many people died, and a lot of impact of what happened through a course of this nation's history and global history as a result. Focusing on the atomic bomb locally in New Mexico, for example, you could argue that there is nothing more influential in the history of the world. You could make that case. You think about it, though, what are the different kind of ways to look at it? What are the different perspectives? And we'll get to that in just a moment. But I think that, certainly the significance is there. What is a history being remembered? So once you establish the significance, once you establish why remember, you need to look at number 2 and look at, well, what is the history? Something may be significant. We may all acknowledge that the bomb is significant, but that doesn't mean we know the history of what happened, right? So you have to do some research of some establishing of a basic narrative to some level to understand what actually happened. What is the history being remembered? What actually happened here? So, if I'm at Gettysburg or if I'm at Los Alamos and I'm standing there, there's only one thing, or I should say, there's only one place that this happened. It's wherever I'm standing, right? And the surrounding area. So what actually happened here? The unique story to that site or symbol or whatever topic that you're talking about. So the third question, what does it mean to remember? This is getting at, what is the intention? What is the intention here? What does it mean? So this really, in the context of the Manhattan Project, it's, well, are we glorifying? Are we celebrating? Are we commemorating? Are we condoning? Are we condemning? I mean, what are we doing by doing so? I think this is where, in the context of the park, you ask the question of, what does it mean to create a national park, to remember it? Is that the best vehicle? Is that the right vehicle? Do you have another vehicle that's maybe more fitting? But what I also try to think about is, for example, right now, let's say the controversies over monuments, right? And I mean, in this case with monuments, I mean the actual artwork of the statues, the metal pieces. Many times the intention is clear to me because of the language that's on the monument. Some monuments are commemorative, some monuments are celebratory. Some monuments, I mean, they're going to be more sad, if you will. If you go to Gettysburg, for example, there are 1,300 monuments and markers. And the monuments that were put up in the 1880s and 1890s by the veterans were very different than the monuments that were put up generations later in the 1960s. There are very few monuments that were put up after the veterans had died, but there are some. And their messaging is very different, very different. The portrayal is going to be one that is looking back to their ancestors rather than one by the veterans themselves looking at what their unit did. So what does it mean to remember? What are you doing when you create a national park or erect that monument? Or if you were to put up a Confederate flag on the state capitol versus in a museum versus, at a school ball game, what does it mean to remember? What is the context? What is the intention? That's something to really think about to help you understand what you're looking at. And finally, that fourth question, how remember? That means, how do you use these sites or artifacts or artwork or symbols to tell a story that's complicated, that's richly layered? There are many people and perspectives, and there are many ways of looking at something. And having worked in this field at Gettysburg and Los Alamos and Martin Luther King home, my job is not to tell you that this is the way you have to interpret it, but rather my job was to maybe use the site to inspire you to want to learn more, to provoke you into thinking deeper, to reflect a little further, and understand that there's more to learn. We often said that interpretation was the seed, not the tree, meaning that I can't cram in all the information in the world in half an hour, or whatever it is. But if we can plant a seed, then you know that there's an ocean of information there to learn. So how do you tell these stories in a way? How do you remember? One of the big things that the Manhattan Project National Historical Park has to deal with is, how do we remember the bomb in a way that is global? There are local community museums in Los Alamos that cover the local stories. That's not the job of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. Manhattan Project National Park is not a local museum. It is one that is national and global. So it has to tell the stories in a way that is, respectful of different perspectives. And they don't lose someone the moment they come in because they think one thing or another. And it's a challenge. This is where interpretation comes in. I know that some of you all may be familiar in the Southwest with how we deal with that in the Southwest, with issues of, indigenous issues and colonialism and all kinds of things. And archaeology has a similar thing to deal with. So how do you tell these stories, from what perspective, and in a way that is bringing together different voices? That is addition, not subtraction, right? Inclusive, not exclusive. And I think that, how you tell these stories is going to reveal a lot about the prior questions as well, including the what does it mean and, what the intention is. Oop. There we go. So what I did with these things was I kind of ran with it. And my objectives, as you can kind of see, once that book came out, I kind of have a larger project I'm working on. And I thought I would get into this a little more with you all, more so than I do with other groups, because this is, after all, a group of writers. And I want to kind of get into sort of the project a little bit, because, I would love kind of what you have to say, as well as maybe it gives you some ideas. So as I described, my objectives are to surprise the current perception. I want you to, the reader, if you will, or someone who is going through this journey, to be surprised about what they find, because the past doesn't just confirm what you already believe. I want to provoke reflective thinking, because I think too often we are, in our own head, diabolical. This is the only way, and I'm certain of it, and it's black and white absolute truth. But I try to kind of provoke someone to reflect. Maybe we should try to think the opposite way of what we think, just to kind of challenge ourselves a little bit. And finally, to inspire further learning, because once you kind of are dislodged from your assumption, I think that kind of inspires going for more learning, because what happens is you decide that, well, there's more to learn. It's not just what I thought I saw. Now you have some known unknowns, so you're going to want to learn more. So with that theme, I came up with these other books that you see in the upper right. And I'm not saying this to promote the book per se. I want you all just to see my writing process. So what happened was that, let's talk social equality, race and religion in politics. I took that same principle that from the previous book of wanting us to reflect a little further, and put in this really just 3 essays that I kind of used to help reflect on these issues of race and religion, but I did so using historical examples. I use a historical example in the first essay of the United States refusing to recognize Haiti as a nation, for 60 years of Haiti's existence. And one of the big reasons for that, or 2 main reasons, one was that we did not want to recognize a country that was the result of a slave uprising, because it was worrisome to us, because we were a slaveholding country and we didn't want to, validate that. And the second one was because we didn't believe that people that were not of European descent would be able to run a civilized government, which is what we thought republics were for civilized people. This is the stuff that they said directly. But yet, on the other hand, you had certain Black leaders, Black American leaders, that looked to Haiti as proof that, they call it the Black Star, as proof of, a capability to participate in the republic. So I look at that and I find some things that I think would be surprising for us in kind of a race relation standpoint today. The second essay covers social equality, that word that really kind of comes up all the time, and its different meanings, and looks at a particular event in 1880s in Richmond, Virginia, in which a Black man introduces a white organizational leader. And there's a big uproar over that, because is this organization implying social equality of Black and white people by allowing that? Yet the organization believed in racially coming together for labor, for the purpose of advancing labor. So labor solidarity, if you will. So there was a line there where Black and white can come together for labor. That equality was okay, but don't go so far as social equality. That's something different. Now, what does social equality mean? Well, that's the problem, is everyone seems to disagree, and they did back then. And that's why sometimes when you press up against those boundaries, you may end up around having this debate. And these debates continue to this day of what equality looks like in a different, maybe some different vocabulary, maybe some different incidents and events, but we still continue to debate that. And part of what I like us to see is that it's something that's always been dynamic. And finally, the religion part of that book is looking at the foundations of what we call the freedom of religion here in this country. And I think we'd be surprised at what some of those foundations for that freedom of religion are. So again, trying to help us see that history is more complicated than what we think the current terms of debate are. And finally, that other book there on the far right, the How Many Ways Did the Founding Fathers Oppose the Constitution? That's meant to kind of make us puzzle a little bit. You mean the Founding Fathers opposed the Constitution? Yes, some Founding Fathers opposed the Constitution. They refused to sign it. Others debated within the states of why we should not ratify the Constitution. I think that kind of dislodges the narrative of the Constitution as we see today of, well, this is the way the Founding Fathers thought about it, and this is the way it is. And it was this, immaculate document. That's not what they thought. There were some people that loved it and some people that hated it. And even those people who liked it or those people who didn't like it within themselves disagreed on what it meant. So again, like that term social equality, the Constitution and what it means and how to unpack it, and even its original intent by its people, by the people that wrote it, was debated. So it's very difficult to kind of see history as static when you think about these kinds of things, because what you see is that, history is something that is malleable. History is something that is more about my memory and how I think about something. So maybe I should kind of step back from my memory and think further about sort of the research and the information that is there. So you can see the theme here is kind of to use, as you can see, the goal to ask questions about the present by choosing to learn from the past. Because if we learn from the past like that, we may ask different questions about the present. We may not so readily accept that social equality means only this. We may not so readily accept that the Constitution has always been this way or that way. We may not so readily accept that a historic site or monument can only mean one thing, that there is nuances and texture to all of these things, and the perspectives matter, and all these things are evolving over time, and ultimately to distinguish between what I call history versus memory. Now, this is not something I came up with, but history is the stuff that actually happened, the study of it, the questions, the inquiry of the past. Memory is how we remember it, not necessarily as personal participants. None of us were around during any of the events that I described. But memory is some sort of understanding of what we have in the past, about the past, based on symbols and manifestations and pop culture around us. Anytime a politician refers to what this country is about, no matter what point they're making on what side, is referring to some notion in your mind of a memory of the founding of the country, one way or another. This whole debate on 1619 versus 1776 is a debate over memory more than it is about history, because it's about how we choose to remember the country when we frame the history. So we're always looking through a lens. You look at the Battle of Gettysburg, how it was remembered in the 1890s versus in the 1960s after the Civil Rights Movement is completely different. The battle didn't change. It wasn't fought again. It was 1863, it was done. How is that the interpretation changed? Because the memory changed, right? So memory is really about how we choose to remember something. How about the atomic bomb? If you're someone that had an ancestor in Hiroshima versus an ancestor in the Second World War that was getting ready to be deployed, you might have a different perspective based on that particular memory, right? Or if you're someone that benefits from nuclear medicine versus someone whose community maybe was damaged by nuclear energy and the waste from nuclear energy, you may have a different perspective. So nuclear isn't just about the bomb per se, it's all those things that come afterward. If you're someone that lived through the Cold War, through the height of the Cold War, you may have a different perspective than someone that didn't. And so these are all things that are going to contribute to how you view the lens that you use to look backward. And so to me, what I try to advocate is I don't have all the answers, but what I do have is ways of navigating through writing and communicating through the reflective thought that writing and reading can provide, and presentation mediums such as this, or what I have down in the lower left there is a screenshot from a television station I was on in Washington, D.C., presenting about this topic. We help then provoke people into this deeper reflection about their memory versus history. So finally, I want to invite you guys to contact me also beyond this with any further discussion. Of course, you know, I can answer questions here. I want to leave up my contact info for a little bit as I talk about the last section of what I want to talk about here. And that is how I researched this, how I came about these books, because that was one of the questions I was asked to discuss. So writing a history book is challenging. I guess writing anything is challenging, but it's a different kind of challenge for each, right? And one of the reasons it's challenging is because there's so much archival research involved. These books, while they came out close to each other, each of these has its roots starting in, I would say, 2003 or 4. And they came out in the last couple of years. So the origin, so this is kind of a 17-year, you know, simultaneous work. I didn't always envision it the way that it turned out, but I did them in pieces over time. And this is where I'm at now. So how did I approach this? Archives are very important. Archival records for different sorts of things, such as old newspapers, such as letters, such as official collections. Those are very important too. Official papers collections, such as organizational histories, like the Knights of Labor, which is one of the organizations I cover in the social equality book. So these are things that you know, you have to look at to be able to get some grounding in, you know, to get some empirical basis, if you will. You also have to look at broader senses of broader narrative histories of the events you're covering, because you want to have some larger context. That's not necessarily archival, that's secondary work. That's going to frame how you look at what you're looking at, because it frames your questions, it frames your understanding what the document that you're reading means in some sort of context, right? And another thing is to seek international voices, such as in the version, it says in the Atomic Bomb book. If you look in the Atomic Bomb book, I looked not only for international coverage as best I could with the language limitation, but I also looked for international context and comparison. So I looked at various controversial historic sites around the world and tried to kind of see, okay, well, how are these places remembered? How are these places preserved? And how are these stories told? And what are the kind of, you know, pitfalls? And what are some of the things that have worked well? So looking internationally was another important thing in my writing process, because it helped me contextualize you know, the Atomic Bomb book, and certainly that's an international issue. So it kind of worked out well in more ways than one. And finally, the other thing I looked at was theory. For example, in the Atomic Bomb, in the Remembering the Atomic Bomb book, I looked at theory of interpretation. You know, how you tell these stories, you know, kind of some of the things I touched on how do you handle stories with different perspectives, and what's the role of interpretation? You know, I looked at theory of, you know, what do national parks and what do public grounds that the state creates, what do those mean, right? So I looked at theory behind that as well. So it takes reading academic literature as well. These are academic journals and articles, monographs, things like that. So it's trying to pull all those pieces together: archival sources, journalism sources, papers collections, secondary historical syntheses to kind of get a narrative, and international perspectives, and finally theory on some of the things that are relevant here to help inform the analysis, to give us a couple different ways of analyzing and looking at different things. And so that's how I think about this stuff, and that's how I approach the books. You the writing process to me was one where I'm someone that writes a lot in a short period of time, and then I go back and edit. That's how I write. Once I'm in focus, I don't want to stop. I guess I'm like the beat writers in that sense, and if you know anything about them in the 50s, but I like to go, 50, 60 hours straight writing. Doesn't mean I write the whole book, but I write until I'm exhausted. And usually I'll write at least a chapter in that time. And then certainly need to edit it after that, but I need it to be one continuous thought. At least a chapter has to be one continuous thought in my mind. Because I have notes all over the place and it's just crazy everywhere. And as I pull pieces together and I'm scratch writing and have my outline and everything, it needs, I don't want to break that flow. I don't want to break that thought process because it's very hard to download again into my brain where I was. And so that's kind of how I write and approach having all these scattered different sources all over the place. And that's kind of how I do this.